In this gripping tale of racism in America, Dr. Ayanna Morgan, a successful black doctor, faces relentless opposition while trying to open a clinic in a small underserved town. Local officials, driven by prejudice and systemic corruption, conspire to sabotage her efforts, using intimidation, unjust arrests, and covert sabotage to shut her down. As leaked emails expose a shocking web of racist intent, Ayanna becomes the target of public humiliation and abuse of power. With tensions boiling over, her determination to challenge the system and fight for justice places her at the center of an explosive battle for equality. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet school parking lot as Miss Grace Turner adjusted the strap of her satchel. The rhythmic click of her heels echoed against the concrete as she approached the staff entrance, her mind already buzzing with lesson plans for her fourth-grade class. The smell of fresh-cut grass and the faint chatter of children playing on the nearby swings brought a small smile to her face. This school had been her sanctuary for years. Teaching wasn't just her profession, it was her calling. Grace took pride in shaping young minds, fostering curiosity and kindness in her students. Yet today, a knot of unease coiled in her stomach. The world outside her classroom seemed to be shifting, small, insidious changes she couldn't ignore. As she entered the building, the familiar scent of polished floors and whiteboard markers greeted her. But something was off. Conversations among her colleagues were hushed, their glances fleeting and uneasy. Grace's smile faltered as she made her way to the teacher's lounge. "Morning, Grace," muttered Mr. Hensley, the gym teacher, his voice lacking its usual jovial warmth. He avoided her gaze, fidgeting with the zipper on his tracksuit. "Morning," Grace replied, her tone questioning. She glanced around, noting how the room seemed to shrink with tension. Whispers trailed off as she passed, replaced by a heavy silence. She didn't have to wait long to learn why. In the principal's office, a meeting was already underway. A meeting she hadn't been invited to. Through the glass window, she caught sight of Principal Baker, her face tight with frustration, seated across from Officer Grayson, the newly assigned school resource officer. His towering frame and crisp uniform dominated the small office, but it was the cold smirk on his face that sent a chill down Grace's spine. When the meeting ended, and Grayson stepped out, his sharp eyes locked onto Grace. He lingered for a moment, his smirk widening as if daring her to question him. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to flinch, even as her pulse quickened. "Miss Turner," he drawled, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Hope you're having a pleasant morning." The tone of his voice suggested otherwise. Grace watched him leave, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. Something was coming. She could feel it, and whatever it was, she would have to stand firm, not just for herself, but for her students, and the dignity of everyone in her community. Dr. Ayanna Morgan had always believed in the power of small steps. As a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon and the founder of one of the most successful non-profit health organizations in the country, she had the resources to live a life of grandeur. Yet, on any given morning, she could be found slipping into a modest brownstone on a quiet street in Elmwood, carrying a grocery bag in one hand and her reusable coffee cup in the other. The neighborhood wasn't flashy or high profile, but Ayanna loved its quiet charm. She had grown up in a community much like this, a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where children played until the streetlights blinked on, and where Sunday dinners weren't just meals but events. It was this grounding that made her who she was, fiercely driven, deeply compassionate, and unrelentingly humble. This morning, Ayanna stood in the small kitchen of her home, arranging fresh flowers into a chipped vase. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the glint of her silver watch, her one indulgence in an otherwise unadorned wardrobe of tailored slacks and button-down shirts. She had a board meeting in 2 hours, but she liked to start her day here, grounding herself in the ordinary before stepping into the extraordinary. The sound of barking dogs and the distant hum of traffic filled the air as she moved to the front porch, coffee cup in hand. From there, she could see the city waking up, a mix of hope and hustle. Her gaze lingered on the street corner, where a young boy pedaled furiously on a rusted bicycle, his laughter ringing out as his little sister ran to catch up. Ayanna smiled, reminded of her own siblings and the days when the world felt big and endless. She glanced at her watch. Time to go. The drive to the hospital took her through a patchwork of neighborhoods. The streets of Elmwood were lined with historic homes and mom-and-pop shops, their painted signs peeling slightly under the wear of years. But the further she drove, the more the scenery changed. Sleek glass buildings and luxury storefronts rose like sentinels, a sharp contrast to the community she'd just left. As Ayana pulled into the hospital parking lot, her phone buzzed. A quick glance revealed a message from her assistant, Elena. Board meeting agenda finalized. Also, media inquiries about the clinic opening in Clearview. Want me to handle it? Ayana smiled faintly, tapping a reply. Yes, thank you. Make sure they understand our focus is on access, not profit. The Clearview Clinic had been a pet project for over a year. A mobile health unit designed to serve communities systematically shut out of quality healthcare. Clearview was a textbook case. A town that prided itself on charm, but hid a festering wound of inequality. The hospital lobby was bustling by the time Ayana arrived. Nurses hurried between stations, and patients sat with quiet anticipation, flipping through outdated magazines. The sterile smell of disinfectant and faintly brewed coffee filled the air. Ayana waved at a familiar face behind the reception desk. "Good morning, Dr. Morgan," called out Anita, the receptionist, her voice bright. "You've got a fan club waiting upstairs." "Let me guess. Finance committee," Ayana replied, her tone dry but playful. Anita chuckled. "You know it. Go show them how it's done." Taking the elevator to the executive floor, Ayana's thoughts drifted to the Clearview project again. There had been murmurs of resistance from the local council. Some saw the clinic as a disruption, a threat to the established order. Others had raised concerns about outsiders coming into their town, a thinly veiled nod to Ayana's race and the predominantly black staff she employed. She had seen it all before, and it never deterred her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. The board meeting proceeded as expected. Discussions of budgets, projections, and a brief but heated debate about expanding services to underserved rural areas. Ayana navigated it with her usual composure, her words calm, yet commanding. By the time the meeting ended, she felt the familiar weight of progress paired with the inevitable pushback. On her way back, Ayana decided to stop for lunch at a local diner near the edge of Clearview. It was a deliberate choice she believed in. Understanding the communities she served, not from glossy reports but by walking their streets, tasting their food, and listening to their stories. The diner was small and unassuming, with a faded sign that read, "Maggie's Place," above the entrance. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of sizzling bacon, and freshly brewed coffee booths lined the walls, and the checkerboard tiles showed their age through scuffs and scratches. It was the kind of place where people lingered, where conversations were loud and laughter came easily. Ayana chose a booth near the window, setting her phone down on the table as a waitress approached. The woman was middle-aged, her apron slightly askew, and her name tag read, Brenda. "What can I get you, hun?" Brenda asked, her voice warm but tired. "Just a coffee and a turkey sandwich, please," Ayana replied, offering a small smile. Brenda nodded, jotting it down on her notepad before disappearing behind the counter. Ayana's eyes drifted to the other patrons, a mix of farmers, construction workers, and a few families. Most paid her no mind, but she caught a flicker of recognition from a man at the counter. His gaze lingered a little too long, his expression unreadable. The tension began to creep in when Brenda returned with her coffee. She set it down carefully, but her voice was quieter now, her eyes darting toward the man at the counter. "Everything okay?" Ayana asked softly, her tone neutral. Brenda hesitated before replying, "It's fine, just let me know if you need anything else." She hurried off, her movements brisk. Ayana glanced toward the counter again. The man had been joined by another, both broad-shouldered and leaning in close, their conversation low, but their occasional glances unmistakable. Her instinct told her to stay calm, to hold her ground. Moments later, one of the men stood and approached her booth. He was older, his face weathered, and his denim jacket stained with grease. He stopped just short of her table, looking her over with a slow, deliberate stare. "Don't think I've seen you around here before," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm just passing through," Ayana replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. The man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Passing through, huh? You one of those city folks coming here to tell us how to live?" Ayana tilted her head slightly, her tone measured. "I'm a doctor. I work with communities to improve access to healthcare." Well, he drawled, we don't need any handouts around here. Folks in Clearview take care of their own. Ayanna didn't miss the challenge in his tone. She chose her words carefully. I'm not here to give handouts, I'm here to make sure everyone has access to what they need, that includes health care. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Before he could respond, Brenda reappeared, her voice tight as she addressed him. Everything all right, Joe? Joe lingered for a moment longer, before stepping back. Just making conversation, he muttered, retreating to his seat. Ayanna exhaled quietly, her expression calm, but her pulse quickening. She knew this wasn't the end of it. People like Joe rarely let things go, especially when they felt their territory, real or imagined, was being encroached upon. As Ayanna paid her bill and stepped outside, she felt the weight of eyes on her. The sunlight was warm on her face, but the tension from inside the diner followed her like a shadow. She paused on the sidewalk, looking out at the small town she was determined to help. This was just the beginning. Ayanna stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, the door of Maggie's place closing behind her with a metallic clang. The tension from inside the diner clung to her like an unwelcome second skin. Her gaze swept the street, scanning for her car parked a block away. Despite the calm facade of the small-town street, her instincts remained sharp. As she walked toward her car, the sound of boots crunching on gravel drew her attention. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of Joe and his companion from the diner. They weren't trying to be discreet, their movements deliberate as they followed her at a measured pace. Ayanna's stomach tightened, but she kept her stride steady. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "Hey, Doc!" Joe called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Where you off to in such a hurry?" Ayanna stopped and turned, meeting his gaze head-on. "Is there something you need?" Joe smirked, the same humorless expression he'd worn inside the diner. His companion, a younger man with a scruffy beard, chuckled lowly. "Just curious about what brings someone like you to our little town," Joe replied. "Don't see many doctors wandering around Clearview unless they're lost." Ayanna kept her expression neutral, even as irritation pricked at her. "I'm here for work. My organization is opening a clinic to serve the community." Joe's eyes narrowed, his tone sharpening. "Funny, nobody asked for a clinic, especially not one run by people like you." The implication was clear, and Ayanna's patience thinned. "Healthcare isn't about being asked," she said calmly. "It's about making sure people have access to what they need." Joe took a step closer, his companion trailing behind. "And what exactly do you think we need?" Ayanna held her ground, her voice steady. "Affordable healthcare, preventative services, support for families who've been overlooked." His smirk deepened, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "Overlooked, huh? Sounds like a fancy way of saying you think we're too stupid to take care of ourselves." Ayanna's pulse quickened, but she refused to rise to the bait. "I never said that," she replied evenly. "I'm here to offer help, not judgment." Joe didn't reply immediately, his gaze roaming over her tailored slacks and simple blouse. "You sure about that? You look like someone who thinks they're better than the rest of us." Ayanna turned away and resumed her walk toward the car, unwilling to continue the conversation. She heard their laughter follow her, the sound grating against her composure. Reaching her car, she unlocked it swiftly and slid inside, locking the doors behind her. As she started the engine, she caught sight of Joe and his companion in her rearview mirror, their figures shrinking as she pulled away. The drive back to her office was quiet, but Ayanna's thoughts were anything but. Incidents like this weren't new to her. She'd faced them in different forms throughout her career. Still, they never failed to leave a bitter taste in her mouth. The challenge wasn't just the prejudice itself, but the constant balancing act of responding without losing her composure or her credibility. Back at the hospital, Ayanna barely had time to sit at her desk before her assistant, Elena, appeared in the doorway, her expression tight. "Dr. Morgan, we've got a situation." Ayanna set her bag down. "What's going on?" "It's about the Clearview Clinic," Elena said, stepping inside and lowering her voice. "Councilman Barnes just called. Apparently, there's been some backlash from the town." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "Backlash from who?" Elena hesitated. He didn't say specifically, but he mentioned concerns about the suitability of the clinic's leadership. He's requesting a meeting with you tomorrow morning to discuss it. Ayana's jaw tightened. She didn't need the specifics to understand what Barnes meant. Did he say what time? 9 a.m. at the town hall, Elena replied. I'll arrange for your materials. Thank you, Ayana said, her voice calm. I'll handle it. Elena nodded, lingering for a moment before adding, You know, if you want me to push back on this. It's fine, Ayana interrupted gently. I appreciate it, but I need to address this myself. As Elena left, Ayana sat down and opened her laptop, pulling up the Clearview Clinic's proposal. She scanned the document, noting the data that supported the need for the clinic, statistics on local health disparities, testimonials from residents, and evidence of systemic gaps in care. The facts were on her side, they always had been. The next morning, Ayana arrived at the Clearview Town Hall, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a sagging American flag. Inside, the air was stuffy, and the sound of murmured conversations echoed off the narrow walls. She was directed to a small conference room where Councilman Barnes was waiting. Barnes was a middle-aged man with a ruddy complexion and a politician's practiced smile. He gestured for Ayana to sit across from him at the worn wooden table. Dr. Morgan, he began, his tone overly polite. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Of course, Ayana replied, sitting straight-backed. I understand there are concerns about the clinic. Barnes nodded, folding his hands on the table. Some of the townsfolk have raised questions about whether the clinic aligns with Clearview's values. They're worried about outside influences and whether this initiative really reflects the needs of our community. Ayana's brow furrowed slightly. The clinic's mission is to address health disparities. Those disparities are well documented, as I'm sure you've seen in the proposal. Barnes nodded again, his expression carefully neutral. I've reviewed the proposal, yes, but there's also concern about optics. Some residents feel that a clinic run by a large organization might not understand the unique character of Clearview. By optics, do you mean the fact that I'm not from Clearview? Ayana asked, her tone measured. Barnes hesitated, his politician's mask slipping for a fraction of a second. It's not about where you're from, Dr. Morgan. It's about ensuring that the clinic represents the community it serves. Ayana leaned forward slightly. With all due respect, Councilman Barnes, the clinic was designed to address gaps in care that have been overlooked for years. I've spoken to dozens of residents who've shared their struggles to access even basic health care. If this is about representation, perhaps we should focus on the patient's needs, not assumptions about my ability to meet them. Barnes's smile faltered. I'm just saying, it's a delicate situation. I'd hate for tensions to rise unnecessarily. Ayana's patience wore thin, but she kept her voice steady. Tensions don't rise because of healthcare, Councilman. They rise because of prejudice. And if that's what's driving this backlash, then perhaps the focus should be on addressing that, not questioning the clinic's value. The room fell silent, the weight of Ayana's words hanging in the air. Barnes cleared his throat, looking down at the papers in front of him. I'll take your concerns under advisement, he said finally, his tone clipped. But I can't promise anything. Ayana stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. That's all I can ask. Thank you for your time, Councilman. As Ayana left the town hall, she spotted Joe standing on the sidewalk, leaning against a pickup truck. His smirk returned as their eyes met. Guess the good doc's got her hands full, huh? He called, loud enough to draw the attention of passers-by. Ayana didn't respond, her gaze fixed ahead. But inside, her frustration simmered. It wasn't just Joe or Barnes or the diner. It was the constant uphill battle to prove her worth in spaces that should have been neutral. She reached her car, exhaling slowly, as she slid into the driver's seat. This was far from over. Ayana's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the streets back to the hospital. The conversation with Councilman Barnes replayed in her mind like a broken record. His words, carefully chosen but sharp with underlying prejudice, clung to her, fueling the fire in her chest. She had faced dismissals and veiled insults before, but this felt different, more pointed, more deliberate. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, pulling her from her thoughts. Glancing down at the screen, she saw Elena's name and answered with a curt, "Yes?" "Dr. Morgan, I just got a call from the Clearview Health Committee, Elena said, her voice laced with unease. They've officially requested a halt on all construction at the clinic site. Something about pending review of leadership and intent. Ayana's breath caught. On what grounds? They wouldn't say, Elena replied, frustration evident. But they've sent Officer Grayson to enforce it. Apparently, he's already at the site. Ayana's stomach sank. Grayson. His name alone carried a storm of implications. She had seen his kind before, men who thrived on unchecked authority, wielding their power like a weapon. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Thank you for letting me know, she said, her voice firm. I'm heading there now. By the time Ayana arrived at the clinic site, a small crowd had gathered. The half-constructed building stood skeletal against the sky, its framework a symbol of both promise and resistance. At the center of the commotion was Officer Grayson, his towering frame clad in his crisp uniform, arms crossed as he barked orders at the construction crew. You heard me, he said loudly, his voice carrying over the sound of machinery being powered down. This site is shut down until further notice. Anyone caught working here will face legal consequences. Ayana stepped out of her car, her heels clicking sharply against the asphalt as she approached. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as people recognized her. She could feel their eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and expectation. Officer Grayson, she called, her voice cutting through the noise. Can you explain what's going on here? Grayson turned slowly, his expression twisting into a smirk when he saw her. Dr. Morgan, he drawled, his tone mocking, didn't expect to see you here so soon. This is my clinic, she said firmly, stopping a few feet away. I have every right to be here. Now, what justification do you have for shutting us down? Grayson took a step closer, his posture oozing condescension. Just following orders, ma'am. The council requested a review of your project, and until that's complete, all work is on hold. Ayana's jaw tightened. A review based on what the council approved this project months ago? We've complied with every regulation. Grayson shrugged, his smirk widening. Guess they had second thoughts. Maybe they're not too keen on outsiders coming in and stirring things up. The crowd murmured again, the tension palpable. Ayana met Grayson's gaze, her own unflinching. This clinic is for the people of Clearview. Your interference only hurts them. Grayson's expression darkened, the smirk replaced by a sneer. Maybe you should have thought about that before stepping on toes you shouldn't have. The standoff was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. Mitchell Farnsworth, a local journalist who had been covering the clinic's progress, pushed his way through the crowd. His wiry frame and camera bag made him look more like an eager student than a seasoned reporter. But Ayana knew him to be sharp and relentless when it came to uncovering the truth. Dr. Morgan, he said, slightly out of breath, I just heard about this. What's happening? Ayana gestured toward Grayson. Officer Grayson here has shut down our construction without any clear justification. Grayson bristled, turning his attention to Mitchell. This doesn't concern you, Farnsworth. Doesn't it? Mitchell replied, pulling out his notepad. The community has a right to know why a much-needed health clinic is being delayed. Care to comment? Grayson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ayana thought he might lash out. Instead, he turned back to the crew and barked, I said shut it down. Mitchell stepped closer to Ayana, his voice low. There's more to this, isn't there? Ayana nodded slightly. Barnes requested a meeting this morning. He hinted at resistance from certain individuals. Certain individuals who probably don't want to see this clinic succeed, Mitchell muttered, scribbling furiously. This reeks of sabotage. The situation escalated when one of the construction workers, a middle-aged man named Tony, approached Ayana, his expression grim. Dr. Morgan, we've got materials on site that'll go bad if we don't keep working concrete's already mixed. Ayana turned to Grayson. Officer, at the very least, allow them to secure the materials. Shutting down construction doesn't mean wasting resources. Grayson's lips curled into a sneer. Not my problem. It will be if the community sees this as deliberate sabotage, Ayana shot back, her voice sharp. You're overstepping, officer. The crowd grew louder, emboldened by Ayana's defiance. Grayson's jaw tightened as he surveyed the gathering faces. For a moment, it seemed he might back down. Instead, he reached for his radio, speaking into it with a curt, "We need backup at the Clearview Clinic site." Ayanna felt her pulse quicken. "Backup for what?" "This is a peaceful gathering." "Just a precaution," Grayson replied, his smirk returning. "You never know when things might get out of hand." Minutes later, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters. The sight sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Ayanna stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. "Dr. Morgan," Grayson said, stepping closer, "I suggest you leave before this gets messy." "I'm not going anywhere," Ayanna replied, her voice steady. "I have every right to be here." Grayson's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Fine," he said coldly. "You want to play tough? Let's see how that works out for you." He signaled to one of the other officers, who approached Ayanna. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction." The words hit her like a blow, but she didn't flinch. "Obstruction of what?" she demanded. "Standing here and defending my work?" The officer hesitated, glancing at Grayson, whose expression was one of smug satisfaction. The crowd erupted into protests, voices rising in defense of Ayanna. "This is wrong," Mitchell shouted, raising his camera. "You're arresting her for standing up for the community?" Grayson ignored the outcry, gesturing for the officer to proceed. Ayanna exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She met Grayson's gaze one last time, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't over." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Ayanna felt the weight of the moment. The crowd's shouts faded into the background as her resolve solidified. She would not be silenced. She would not back down. Ayanna sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists sore from the too tight handcuffs. The sounds of the crowd outside still echoed faintly through the reinforced glass, their protests muffled but persistent. Mitchell had been shouting questions at the officers until one of them warned him to step back or face arrest himself. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. This wasn't the first time she'd faced adversity, but being paraded off the clinic site in handcuffs was a new kind of humiliation. Her clinic, her vision for providing care to an underserved community, was under attack, and now her character was being dragged through the mud. The officer driving the car glanced at her in the rearview mirror. His face betrayed nothing, a blank wall of indifference. Ayanna kept her gaze on the window, her jaw tight. She wouldn't let them see how deeply this stung. The precinct was small and outdated, its walls a drab gray with faded posters about community policing and crime prevention. Ayanna was led inside, her presence drawing curious looks from a few officers milling about. The whispers started almost immediately. "This is Dr. Morgan," Grayson announced loudly, his voice thick with mockery. "Our local hero, obstructing justice." Ayanna remained silent as they guided her to the booking desk. The officer there, young, with nervous eyes, seemed hesitant as he processed her paperwork. "Ma'am, I need to take your personal belongings," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Ayanna replied, her tone calm. She handed over her watch, her phone, and her wallet with steady hands, her movements deliberate. If they wanted her to crack, they would be disappointed. "Dr. Morgan," Grayson said, stepping closer, his smirk returning. "You should have just stayed out of it. But I guess some people can't help but stir up trouble." Ayanna met his gaze, her voice icy. "And I guess some people can't help but abuse their power." His smirk faltered, and for a moment, Ayanna saw a flash of anger in his eyes, but he quickly recovered, leaning in closer. "Careful, Doc. You wouldn't want to make things worse for yourself." Before Ayanna could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Grayson." The commanding tone belonged to Captain Daniels, a grizzled veteran who had clearly seen his share of conflict. His presence filled the room, and even Grayson seemed to shrink slightly under his glare. "Captain," Grayson began, but Daniels held up a hand. "I said, enough." He turned to Ayanna, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Morgan, you'll be placed in a holding cell while we sort this out. If you have any complaints about your treatment, you can file them with me directly." "Thank you, Captain," Ayanna said, her voice steady. "I will." The cell was small and cold, With metal benches bolted to the walls and a flickering fluorescent light casting harsh shadows, Ayanna sat with her back straight, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she wouldn't let it crush her. Through the bars, she could hear muffled voices, Grayson's loud and indignant, Daniel's lower and measured. Though she couldn't make out the words, it was clear that the two men were arguing. Moments later, Mitchell's voice echoed faintly down the hall. Ayanna's heart lifted slightly at the sound of her ally. "I'm not leaving until someone tells me why Dr. Morgan was arrested," Mitchell demanded. "You've got half the town in an uproar out there." "You're not authorized to be here," Grayson snapped. "Leave, or I'll have you removed." "Let him stay," Daniels interjected, his tone sharp. "We don't need to escalate this further." Left alone with her thoughts, Ayanna began strategizing. She couldn't afford to let this derail her clinic or her reputation. She needed to shift the narrative, and she knew Mitchell could be key to that. When Daniels finally approached her cell, she stood to meet him, her expression calm but unyielding. "Dr. Morgan," he began, "you'll be released shortly. No charges are being filed." "Am I free to go? Or is there something else?" Ayanna asked, her voice steady. Daniels sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You were arrested under Grayson's orders, and I'll be reviewing his actions, but I'd recommend you tread carefully moving forward. There are people in this town who don't take kindly to—" "To what, Captain?" Ayanna interrupted, her gaze piercing. "To being held accountable, to someone standing up against systemic failures." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "You've made some powerful enemies here, Dr. Morgan." "Good," Ayanna said firmly. "That means I'm doing something right." When Ayanna stepped out of the precinct, she was met with a wall of sound. A crowd had gathered, their voices raised in support. Many held signs that read, "Justice for Dr. Morgan," and "Clearview needs this clinic." Mitchell was at the forefront, his camera capturing every moment. "Elena organized this," he said as he approached her, a faint smile on his face. Word spread fast. Ayanna's chest swelled with gratitude as she faced the crowd. She raised her hands, and the noise began to quiet. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you for standing with me. What happened today is just one example of the challenges we face when trying to make change. But let me be clear. This clinic will open, and we will not be silenced." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy invigorating her. Grayson stood in the shadows near the precinct door, his expression dark, but Ayanna paid him no mind. Her focus was on the people, the ones who needed her, the ones she refused to let down. As the crowd began to disperse, Mitchell pulled Ayanna aside. "You need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. On the screen was a leaked email thread between Councilman Barnes and several influential figures in Clearview, including Grayson. The messages detailed a deliberate effort to block the clinic, citing concerns about cultural alignment and preserving the town's traditions. Ayanna's stomach turned as she read the words. It wasn't just resistance, it was a coordinated attack steeped in prejudice. She handed the phone back to Mitchell, her resolve hardening. "This isn't just about me anymore," she said quietly. "This is about exposing the whole system." Mitchell nodded. "I'll publish it, but you know they're going to fight back hard." "Let them," Ayanna replied, her voice steely. "I'm ready." Ayanna stood outside the council chambers, the leaked emails from Councilman Barnes still fresh in her mind. Mitchell had promised to publish the story within the hour, but she couldn't wait for the fallout. The corruption and prejudice needed to be confronted directly and publicly. She adjusted her blazer, inhaling deeply as she prepared to face the very people who had tried to dismantle her work. Inside the chamber, the council meeting was already in session. Councilman Barnes sat at the center of the long oak table, flanked by his colleagues, each wearing varying expressions of discomfort and anticipation. Officer Grayson was seated near the back, his arms crossed, his smirk as smug as ever. The audience benches were filled with curious locals, including a few of Ayanna's supporters who had followed her from the precinct. Barnes looked up as Ayanna entered, his face tightening. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice strained but polite. "This is a closed session. If you have concerns, you can schedule a—" "With all due respect, Councilman," Ayanna interrupted, her tone firm but composed. I'm not here to wait in line or play by rules designed to silence me. I'm here because the truth needs to be heard." The room buzzed with murmurs. Barnes's jaw tightened, but he gestured toward an empty chair. "You may have a seat." Ayanna didn't sit. Instead, she placed a copy of the leaked emails on the table in front of him. "Care to explain these?" Barnes paled, his carefully constructed facade slipping. "I'm not sure what you're insinuating," he said, though his voice wavered. "Then allow me to clarify," Ayanna said, her voice rising just enough to command the room's attention. "This email thread, signed by you, outlines a deliberate effort to block the Clearview Clinic. Your words, Councilman, describe concerns about cultural alignment and preserving traditions. Traditions, I assume, that don't include equitable healthcare for all." Gasps rippled through the room. Barnes fumbled for a response, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his papers. "Those emails are taken out of context," he said finally, though the weakness in his voice betrayed him. Ayanna leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "What context justifies denying healthcare to the people of this town? What context justifies working with law enforcement to harass and intimidate me and my team?" Barnes's mouth opened, but no words came out. Grayson, however, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a smear campaign," Grayson barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You come into this town with your high and mighty ideas, trying to make us look bad, but we don't need saving, and we certainly don't need you." Ayanna turned to face him, her expression calm but searing. "What you don't need, Officer Grayson, is accountability. That much is clear." Grayson took a step toward her, his posture aggressive. "You don't know a damn thing about this town." "I know enough," Ayanna replied, her voice unwavering. "I know that people here are being denied basic human rights because of people like you and Councilman Barnes, people who would rather cling to their own biases than see their neighbors thrive." The room erupted into noise, half the crowd shouting in support of Ayanna, the other half protesting her accusations. Barnes banged his gavel, demanding order, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. "Enough!" Barnes shouted, his face flushed as the room finally quieted. "This is ridiculous. These accusations are baseless, and this meeting is adjourned." "You don't have the authority to adjourn the truth," Ayanna said sharply, her words slicing through the air. "The people of this town deserve to know what's happening here." Mitchell, who had been quietly filming from the back of the room, stood and addressed the council. "The leaked emails have already been sent to multiple news outlets. By the end of the day, the entire state will know about this." Barnes's face twisted in anger. "You're out of line." "No, you're out of line," Ayanna countered, stepping closer to the table. "You're out of line for abusing your power, for conspiring to sabotage a project that could save lives, and for perpetuating a system that prioritizes ego over justice." Grayson's voice cut in, cold and venomous. "You think you can just walk in here and tear us down? You're nothing but an outsider trying to play savior." Ayanna turned to him, her voice calm but razor sharp. "And you're a man so consumed by your own insecurities that you can't stand to see someone else succeed. You may think you're protecting this town, but all you're doing is holding it back." Grayson lunged forward, his temper boiling over, but Captain Daniels, who had been standing quietly at the side, stepped in. "That's enough," Daniels said, his tone commanding. "Grayson, sit down." For a moment, it looked as though Grayson might defy him, but the room's collective gaze seemed to weigh him down. He stepped back reluctantly, his face a mask of fury. Daniels turned to Ayanna, his expression grim. "Dr. Morgan, I suggest you file a formal complaint with the state. This is bigger than any one of us." Ayanna nodded, her resolve unshaken. "I intend to." As Ayanna stepped outside, the crowd that had gathered earlier was still there, their numbers swelling. Supporters held signs demanding justice, while detractors shouted accusations of impropriety. The tension in the air was thick, the lines between ally and adversary drawn starkly. Mitchell caught up with her, his camera still rolling. "That was bold," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "But what now?" "Now," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing around her. "We keep fighting. This isn't just about me or this clinic, it's about what this town deserves." At that moment, a car screeched to a halt nearby. A man stepped out, holding a printed copy of the leaked emails. "Dr. Morgan," he called, his voice urgent. "Is this real?" Ayanna nodded. "Every word." The man turned to the crowd, holding the papers aloft. "They've been lying to us," he shouted. "We need this clinic." The crowd erupted, their chants growing louder. Ayanna stood in the midst of the chaos, her heart pounding. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, she felt the tide turning. As Ayanna prepared to address the crowd, a hand gripped her arm. She turned to see Grayson, his face a mask of quiet fury. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Ayanna met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." With that, she stepped forward to face the crowd, ready to fight for the truth. Ayanna stood at the head of the crowd, the chants of her supporters roaring behind her like an unstoppable tide. The emails Mitchell had leaked had lit a fire under the community, bringing out not just her allies, but also those who had quietly accepted the status quo for years. Yet, as the crowd pressed in, shouting for justice and demanding accountability, Ayanna's focus zeroed in on the steps of Clearview's town hall. Councilman Barnes and Officer Grayson stood just outside the doors, their expressions stark contrasts. Barnes looked pale, sweat gleaming on his forehead as he clutched a crumpled copy of the leaked emails. Grayson, on the other hand, stood rigid, his jaw clenched, and his eyes burning with a fury that sent a clear message. He wasn't going down without a fight. Ayanna walked toward them, her back straight and her head high. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade as she ascended the steps, leaving only the thunder of her heartbeat and the steady rhythm of her determination. "You've caused quite a mess, Dr. Morgan," Barnes said, his voice shaking as he tried to maintain some semblance of authority. "Releasing those emails." "Releasing the truth," Ayanna interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a blade. "Let's call it what it is." Barnes swallowed hard, glancing at Grayson, whose fists were clenched at his sides. "The emails don't tell the whole story," Barnes stammered. There are nuances." "Nuances?" Ayanna said, stepping closer. Her voice carried the weight of every injustice she had faced, every battle she had fought. "What nuance justifies denying people access to health care? What nuance makes systemic racism acceptable?" Barnes opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked out at the crowd, searching for support, but the sea of faces was resolute. The murmurs of the people only grew louder, their anger building like a storm. Grayson stepped forward, his voice booming. "This isn't about healthcare or justice, this is about you stirring up trouble where there wasn't any. You come in here with your so-called clinic and think you can change the way we do things. Clearview doesn't need outsiders telling us how to run our town." "And there it is," Ayanna said, her voice calm but laced with fire. She turned to face the crowd, gesturing toward Grayson. "This is what we're fighting against. Not just a broken system, but the people who will do anything to keep it that way. People like Officer Grayson, who abuse their power to intimidate and silence those who dare to challenge them." "You're out of line," Grayson snarled, taking another step toward her. "No, officer," Ayanna said, her voice rising. "You are, and you've been out of line for a long time." Mitchell emerged from the crowd, holding his phone high. "Dr. Morgan," he called, his voice urgent. "There's more." Ayanna turned, and Mitchell jogged up the steps to join her. "Another leak just came through," he said, showing her the screen. "A whistleblower from the council's office. They've sent proof that Grayson was paid off by Barnes to shut down the clinic." The crowd erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, and angry murmurs swept through the assembly like wildfire. Barnes's face turned an alarming shade of red, and he stumbled back, shaking his head. "This is preposterous!" he shouted. "A smear campaign lies!" Mitchell handed the phone to Ayanna, and she scrolled through the documents, her fury mounting with each line. Payments disguised as security allocations. Emails detailing the coordinated effort to block her project. Every piece of evidence was damning. "Preposterous?" Ayanna repeated, holding up the phone for the crowd to see. "This is your corruption, Councilman. This is your abuse of power, Officer Grayson. The people of Clearview deserve better than this." Grayson lunged forward, his face a mask of rage. "You think you're untouchable?" he spat. "You think this changes anything?" But before he could get closer, Captain Daniels appeared, his expression grim. He placed a firm hand on Grayson's chest, stopping him in his tracks. "Step back, Grayson," Daniels said, his voice low and commanding. "This is over." Grayson turned on Daniels, his fury redirected. "You're siding with her after everything she's done?" Daniels's gaze didn't waver. "The only one who's done something wrong here is you, and you'll answer for it." Ayanna stepped forward, addressing the crowd with unwavering resolve. "This fight isn't just about me or this clinic, it's about the power we give to people like Barnes and Grayson, and the power we take back when we refuse to be silenced. Today, we've exposed their corruption, but this is only the beginning. Together, we can rebuild Clearview into a place where everyone has the opportunity to thrive." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants echoing through the streets. Ayanna looked out at the faces before her. Young and old, black and white, united in their determination to see justice done. But as she turned back to face Barnes and Grayson, the weight of what came next settled on her shoulders. The documents and emails were only the first step. There would be investigations, legal battles, and countless attempts to discredit her. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As the crowd began to disperse, Ayanna approached Mitchell, who was already on a call with a major news outlet. "Keep pushing the story," she told him. "The people need to know everything." Mitchell nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "You've got it." Ayanna turned back to the town hall, where Captain Daniels was leading Grayson inside Barnes, looking utterly defeated. Slinked away toward the back entrance, Ayanna considered going after him, but decided against it. His reckoning would come soon enough. As she stood on the steps, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Elena. "National media is picking up the story. Prepare for interviews." Ayanna exhaled, her determination hardening into resolve. This was the fight she had chosen, and she wouldn't back down. But as she descended the steps and walked toward her car, the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed large. The system she was up against was vast and deeply entrenched. Exposing Barnes and Grayson was a victory, but it was only a small part of a much larger battle. The aftermath of the confrontation spread like wildfire. By the next morning, Clearview was at the center of a media storm. News outlets replayed the footage of Ayanna's impassioned speech and Mitchell's revelations about the leaked emails, turning the small town into a symbol of systemic corruption and grassroots resistance. At the Clearview Town Hall, the atmosphere was tense. Councilman Barnes had officially stepped down, citing personal reasons. Though everyone knew it was the mounting evidence against him that had forced his hand. Officer Grayson, meanwhile, had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. The State Department of Justice announced they would be conducting a full inquiry into Clearview's local government and law enforcement practices. The community was buzzing with a newfound energy. Ayanna stood outside the nearly completed clinic, her team working tirelessly to ensure its grand opening could move forward without further delays. She watched as volunteers unloaded supplies and painted murals on the clinic's walls. Bright, hopeful images of families, healing, and unity. Mitchell approached, a triumphant smile on his face. "The story's gone national," he said, holding up his phone. "Your name is everywhere." Ayanna smiled faintly, glancing at the growing crowd of volunteers. "It's not about my name," she said. "It's about what we're building here." "And you're building more than a clinic," Mitchell replied. "You've lit a fire under this town. People are finally asking questions about who's in power and how they got there." "That's the goal," Ayanna said, her tone resolute. "Change starts with awareness." Later that evening, Ayanna stood on the porch of her modest home, sipping tea as she read the latest updates from her team. Her phone buzzed with a call from Captain Daniels. "Dr. Morgan," Daniels said, his voice measured. "I wanted to let you know that the state investigators have officially opened a case against Barnes and Grayson. It'll take time, but justice is moving." "Thank you, Captain," Ayanna said, "for stepping in when it mattered." Daniels hesitated, then added, "I've been part of this system for a long time, maybe too long. Seeing what you've done here, it's made me realize I need to do better. We all do." "You're taking the first step," Ayanna said. "That's what matters." After the call ended, Ayanna allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The events of the past week had pushed her to the brink, but they had also reminded her of her purpose. She had faced humiliation, resistance, and danger, yet she had stood firm. And in doing so, she had not only exposed corruption, but also inspired a community to demand more. 2 weeks later, the Clearview Clinic officially opened its doors. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by residents from all corners of the town, their faces alight with hope and pride. Ayanna stood at the podium, flanked by her team and community leaders who had rallied to support her. "This clinic isn't just a building," Ayanna said, her voice strong and clear. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to be silenced. When we stand together, we can overcome any obstacle." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy palpable. Ayanna glanced at Mitchell, who gave her a thumbs up, his camera still rolling. In the weeks following the clinic's opening, more changes began to unfold. The state's investigation into Clearview's government and law enforcement uncovered years of misconduct, leading to several resignations and the implementation of new oversight policies. The clinic became a beacon of hope, not just for Clearview, but for neighboring towns as well. Patients flooded in, grateful for the affordable and accessible care they had long been denied. Ayanna's nonprofit received an outpouring of support, allowing them to expand their reach even further. But challenges remained. Grayson's supporters rallied against the investigation, and Ayanna continued to face resistance from those who viewed her as an outsider. Yet she knew that progress was never without its hurdles. One evening, as the clinic settled into its rhythm, Ayanna sat in her office, reviewing patient reports. The familiar hum of activity outside was comforting, a reminder that their work was making a tangible difference. Elena knocked on the door, stepping in with a smile. "You should see this," she said, holding out her phone. Ayanna took it and watched a video of a young boy named Marcus, one of the clinic's first patients. He was grinning ear to ear, holding up a drawing he had made of the clinic. The caption read, "Because of the clinic, Marcus can run and play without pain. Thank you, Dr. Morgan." Tears welled in Ayanna's eyes as she handed the phone back to Elena. "This is why we fight," she said softly. Elena nodded. "And it's why we keep going." As Ayanna walked out of her office that night, the stars above Clearview seemed brighter than they had in weeks. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of peace. The journey had changed her, strengthened her resolve, deepened her understanding of the power of community, and reminded her of the impact one person could have when they refused to give up. As she locked the clinic doors and walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a message from a neighboring town. They were requesting her help in establishing a similar clinic. Ayanna smiled, already thinking of how to begin. As Ayanna Morgan stood on the steps of the Clearview Clinic, watching the last of the day's patients leave with smiles and bags of much-needed medication, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the hum of crickets awakening for the night. The clinic, her vision for equitable healthcare, was finally thriving. Yet, the journey here had been anything but easy. The events of the past few months played in her mind like an old film, moments of triumph and despair, of standing tall and breaking down. She thought of the faces that had stood against her, Councilman Barnes, Officer Grayson, and the system they represented. She also thought of the faces that had stood with her, Mitchell, Elena, Captain Daniels, and the countless Clearview residents who had chosen hope over fear. In many ways, the clinic had become a reflection of the community itself. Battered but resilient, facing resistance, but refusing to fall. The Ayanna of today was not the same woman who had first driven into Clearview with blueprints and optimism. She had always been strong, but the trials she had faced here had tempered that strength into something unshakable. She had learned to stand firm in the face of overt hatred and subtle prejudice, to use her voice not just as a tool for persuasion, but as a weapon against injustice. More importantly, Ayanna had learned the power of collective action. As much as she had led the fight, she had not won it alone. The community had rallied around her, drawn not just by her words, but by the promise of a better future. Their resilience had fueled hers, reminding her that change wasn't something to be handed down. It was something to be built, piece by piece, by the people who needed it most. The battle for the Clearview Clinic was about more than just one building. It was a microcosm of larger systemic struggles that plagued communities across the country. entrenched racism, abuse of power, and the barriers that kept the marginalized from accessing the resources they deserved. Barnes and Grayson were products of a system that thrived on exclusion and fear, their actions emblematic of a much deeper problem. But the exposure of their corruption, and the community's refusal to back down, had sent ripples far beyond Clearview. The state investigation had uncovered not only Barnes's and Grayson's misdeeds, but also a web of systemic failures that stretched through local government, and law enforcement policies were being rewritten, leadership was being re-examined. Conversations about equity and accountability were happening in places where silence had once reigned. For Ayanna, this was the real victory. Not the fall of two men, but the awakening of a community to its power. Systems only hold as much power as we allow them, she had told the crowd during the clinic's grand opening. When we demand better, when we refuse to be complicit, we force those systems to change. Ayanna hoped that her story, her fight, would inspire others to confront the injustices in their own lives. She knew the path she had walked wasn't unique. There were countless others facing similar battles in quiet towns and bustling cities alike. But she also knew that resilience could be contagious. If one person could find the courage to speak up, it could ignite a fire in others, creating a movement too powerful to ignore. Her experience in Clearview had shown her that progress wasn't linear. For every step forward, there had been forces trying to pull her back, yet it was the determination to keep moving, to take another step, and then another, that had made all the difference. We all have a role to play, Ayanna often told her team. Whether it's marching in the streets, voting for change, or simply refusing to look away, every action matters. As the clinic continued to grow, so did Ayanna's vision. Requests for similar clinics were pouring in from nearby towns, and her nonprofit was working to expand its reach. She had been invited to speak at conferences and community forums, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. But despite the accolades and the growing spotlight, Ayanna remained grounded. Her heart, as always, was with the people. She spent her days in the clinic, talking to patients, training staff, and ensuring that the care they provided wasn't just medical, but also compassionate and culturally attuned. She knew the fight for justice wasn't over, but she also knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The scars of the battle still lingered. Ayanna continued to face criticism from those who saw her as a disruptor, an outsider. The remnants of Barnes's and Grayson's supporters occasionally surfaced, their rhetoric aimed at undermining the progress she had made. Yet, Ayanna met these challenges with the same calm defiance she had shown on the town hall steps. Progress, she reminded herself, was never without its costs. But for every hurdle, there was a Marcus, a child who could now run and play because of the care he had received. There was a mother who no longer had to choose between feeding her family and paying for medication. There was a community that had learned to believe in its own power. It was these victories, small but profound, that fueled her. They were reminders that even in the face of systemic injustice, change was possible. As Ayanna locked the clinic doors one quiet evening, she looked back at the mural on the front wall, a vibrant image of hands reaching toward the sky. Intertwined in unity below it, the words, "Together we heal," were painted in bold letters. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mitchell. "You're trending again. National News wants an interview." Ayanna smiled and typed back, "Tell them I'll talk, but only if we focus on the work, not the drama." She slipped her phone into her pocket and turned toward the parking lot, the stars above Clearview bright and endless. The fight wasn't over. She knew that. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. As she walked to her car, her steps steady and sure, she thought of the journey ahead. There would be more battles to fight, more systems to confront. But she also thought of the allies she had gained, the lives she had touched, and the community she had helped to empower. Ayanna Morgan was no stranger to adversity, but she had learned one undeniable truth. When people stand together, there is no injustice too great to overcome. And with that, she drove into the night, ready for whatever came next.